Hello, welcome to week 3 of our Weeping with Those Who Weep series on ministering to those who are grieving. If you did not yet listen to or see sessions 1 and 2, I recommend looking at those before you watch this one. By way of review, in session 1, we laid a biblical foundation of grief. We noted, most importantly, that grief in and of itself is not a sin, and therefore it's not something that we need to fix. Many of us go into ministry to the grieving with the mindset of I have to cheer the person up or fix their problem, but the reality is they are grieving because something sad has truly happened. And as part of the human condition, they are sad, and that's acceptable. The Bible tells us there's a time to mourn and to weep with those who weep. And thus, when we minister, we are not looking so much to push them over their grief, but to enter into the grief with them. Remember that grief is a heaviness that comes with living life in a sin-cursed world. And our role as ministers to those who are grieving is simply to bear the burden with them. The week after, or last week, week 2, we talked about typical things or what you should say, what you should not say. And that really just laid down biblical or practical principles, much of which are taken from this book that I have found very helpful called What Grieving People Wish You Knew, about what really helps and what really hurts, by Nancy Guthrie. What she has done in this book is she's taken, she and her husband themselves have grieved as they have lost a small child. And in addition to that, they have interviewed many people and corresponded with many people who have themselves gone through grief in order to assess, as Christians, minister to them. What did people say to you that was helpful and what was not helpful? And what do you wish people have said? So many of this is based upon testimony. It's practical, and I find it's helpful. So none of what I'm saying, of course, if it's not based on God's word, is binding and eternal and meant to be as absolute. So, for example, in tonight's session, when we talk about things people say and what you should say instead, we're not laying down a rule that says you can never, ever, in any context, use these phrases, but I hope it challenges you and me to think more specifically and effectively about the things that we say so that we can be more effective. We'll begin with our verse for today, which is Ephesians 4:29. The Bible says, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." Now, what I want to talk about as it relates to tonight's session is sort of hidden in this verse, and bear with me as I try to explain what I mean. In this verse, the Apostle Paul, under the inspiration of the Spirit, basically identifies two extremely opposite functions of our speech. Right? We established this last week. The Bible has a lot to say about speech and how we use our tongues. Our tongues can be, as James says, just a little member, but it could spark a flame of fire that can really do a lot of damage. But a timely spoken word can be like apples of gold and settings of silver. So Paul pretty much summarizes those two extremes in this verse by saying that we should reject corrupting talk and embrace talk that builds up. And so you see two opposite functions here. One is corruption. Corruption is that which breaks down, tears down, and the other one is edification, that which builds up. And so we could ask this question every time we talk, not just to the grieving, but all the time. Am I corrupting or am I building up? Am I tearing down or am I building up? The way that we talk is an evidence of God's grace in our life. J. Sidlow Baxter said, one of the first things that happens when a man is really filled with the Spirit is not that he speaks with tongues, but that he learns to hold the one tongue he already has. When we get saved, the Holy Spirit comes to live within us. We're born again. We're given a new nature. And one of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control. And in many circles of Christianity, maybe they're looking for evidence of faith in speaking in tongues and signs and wonders, but really it's the one who has his tongue under self-control that points to the fact that God has indeed done a work in his heart. And so Paul here tells us we should reject that which corrupts, we should embrace that which builds up, and we should do it, as he says, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. I think that's a great qualifier because, as I tried to make clear last week, and I will continue to say it maybe even to the point of redundancy in this session, is that the Bible says a lot about tact. And by tact, I mean, yes, there's true doctrine we hold to, but true doctrine has to be administered in a loving way, in a way that considers the timing, the person, the sensitivity to their needs. You may have all the ins and outs of systematic theology completely, memorized. You might have a copy of Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology, or maybe you go even deeper and you have Herman Bavinck's 4-volume set of Reformed Dogmatics. But it would not be appropriate for you to take that 4-volume set with you to a funeral, wait on the funeral line and go to someone who's grieving and start preaching that person. So I make that qualifier because sometimes in the course of these talks, I talk about, don't say this at this time, and it could be interpreted as, well, the pastor just said, don't say something that's true. Well, no, we're not endorsing that you would hide the truth or water down the truth, but you should know how to administer the truth and do it in love. And so when Paul here says, as fits the occasion, I think it's also speaking to that issue of time, of knowing the time and the context in which you say something, with the ultimate goal of what? That it may give grace to those who hear, right? God's grace, God's favor. The person who's grieving, even though he might be a Christian, might feel as though he's not in God's good graces. We've established this, I think 2 weeks ago. We talked about how part of the biblical grieving process is to feel a lack of nearness to God. God feels far. David cries out, "My God, why have you forsaken me? How long, O Lord?" And you could stand by David and say, well, David, technically God is, omnipresent. The point is, the grieving person feels far from God. Maybe even feels that he's no longer under God's smiling countenance, but under God's dark providence. And so it is essential for us as we minister grace that we understand that our mouths become a means of grace, a means of demonstrating to the person that despite the suffering and the hardship they're going through right now, God's grace is upon them. We don't often think of our speech like that, right? We think the means of grace are the sacraments or the ordinances of the church, or the preaching or the fellowship or the worship, but your speech to the grieving person is a means of grace. So we must use it wisely. Now, like I said, there are 2 functions in this verse: corruption and edification. And my thesis really for this evening, before I get into Guthrie's suggestions, is to say that it is not enough just to avoid evil words. Listen to Proverbs 10:19, which says, "When there are many words, transgression is unavoidable, but he who restrains his lips is wise." And Proverbs 29:20 says, "Do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than for him." The Bible doesn't just condemn wicked speech. It also condemns idle speech. And I fear that, especially in our generation, and I can testify to this in my own life, it is really idle speech that we have an issue with. Vain, empty words. I believe that a Christian can, over time, find victory over corrupt speech that demeans people, speech filled with foul language and cursing. And yet, it doesn't mean just because you have victory over one, that automatically your speech is edifying, building up, ministers grace. And so I'm speaking to that middle level. By middle, I don't mean it's half good, half bad. It's still bad, right? But it's that vain speech. We talked about last week the awkwardness of silence. When you're dealing with someone who's grieving, there's a silence that may come over the room. Nobody's talking, and it feels awkward. And sometimes we're tempted to break the silence, and we'll just say something. We'll try to be cheery or funny or whatever to break that awkwardness. And that is an example of hasty speech. And so tonight, as we look at the different examples of things people say, they may not necessarily be corrupt talk, but they're certainly not edifying talk either. They are vain, empty, idle phrases that don't minister grace to the grieving. And I think if we analyze them think a little bit more deeply about them, and then offer suggestions to what you can say instead, then you and I would be helped with that. So to reiterate, Ephesians 4:29 onwards, there are two opposite functions: corruption or edification. You can either build up or tear down. Remember that in our speech, we ought to have tact, and that includes administering grace and the timing and the context in which you say something to somebody. And we have to ask our question, right? Do we build up, or is our speech empty? Just because we have overcome the corrupt speech doesn't mean that our speech is necessarily helpful and edifying. So today's session will then highlight common empty phrases and how we can instead say things to help those who are grieving. What are some typical things people say? Maybe you've said some of these things. Maybe you've said forms of these things. Maybe someone has said these things to you as you have grieved. Here's a list of some things, and then some parts of this list we'll analyze, and then we'll add maybe some other phrases as well. I guess God just needed another angel in heaven. Well, at least you have other children. Something said to, obviously, parents who lost a child. It must have been God's plan. You know that God will never give you more than you can handle. God needed her with him more than we needed her here. I'm sending you good thoughts or good vibes. Just think about how God is going to use you because of what you've been through. I know when you look at that, you look at those statements, you're like, wait a second. Okay, some of these are downright insensitive. Some of these, though, have a kernel of truth, or technically true on the surface level. So why are we putting them all together? Well, because some of them fail to pass the building up ministering grace test, because just like we said, they're insensitive. But some of them are true, but said in the wrong context at the wrong time can be interpreted differently. And the testimonies of grieving people testify to that. So hopefully this will be helpful as we discover what we can say instead. So here is a list of 10 typical phrases and how we could improve on them. The first one is, you'll be fine, you're strong. You'll be fine, you're strong. Now, when you say that to someone who's grieving, certainly your intention is most likely to encourage, right? You want to help such a person get over his or her grief. And so you say, you'll be fine, right? You'll be fine. But what does the person hear? The grieving person, when they hear, you'll be fine, you'll be strong, you're good, you're not allowed to show weakness. This loss isn't significant enough to impact you forever. So keep that in mind. As we've established last week, we do not ever want to delegitimize the loss or delegitimize the feeling that our grieving person has. We're to enter into that grief. And so when you say you'll be fine, is to say, hey, that loss you're feeling right now, it'll go away, because the loss that you feel isn't really that significant. Now, of course, you don't mean to say that, right? But that's what's being communicated here. One person said this: stop telling me to be strong. Let me be weak before Christ who strengthens me. It's interesting that when we're in times of victory, we'll say things like, it's Christ who gives me strength. I'm nothing, Christ is everything. But when it comes to grief, how much more we have to understand our weakness, because we feel it. Sometimes when in victory, we feign weakness. We pretend like we're weak when at the end of the day, we're still battling pride. When you're grieving, it's very difficult to not see heaviness and your weakness all around you. And so this is a wonderful opportunity for the person to truly rest in the strength of Christ, to truly say, his strength is made perfect in my weakness. And so when you say, you'll be fine, you're strong, you're making their weakness seem like it's a problem when it's clearly not. So what do you say instead? You say something like, I can't imagine how hard things are for you right now, but I will be with you. I will be with you during these times, right? In saying that you're legitimizing their mourning. You're not telling them to get over it. And you're saying, I'll be with you in the morning. And you could add, I'll pray that God gives you grace you need to face every day, whatever it brings. Grace for the day, right? God's grace is sufficient for the day. You don't know what the future's like. Don't tell that person that he's going to get over it. It's going to be strong, but say, look, the days are difficult, but God will give you grace to endure each day. Number 2, you can have more children. Now, this one is, I think, probably a lot more obviously insensitive, and it could be the way it's worded. Maybe you've never said that to a couple who's lost a child, but maybe you've said forms of things. Maybe you've tried to get them to realize that despite their loss, they still have other blessings. So what you mean by that is like good intentions, right? You mean to say, look at the bright future, right? Don't dwell on the negative, dwell on the positive. But what does the grieving think when you say something like that? What they think is, maybe I will have other children, but I won't ever have this child with me, and that hurts. Yeah. I mean, is there something about that particular child that he or she can be forgotten? Of course not. There was this one lady mentioned in the book, she's 38 years old, had a miscarriage. She felt that this was her only chance to have a child. And people in the church continually told her, God's going to give you a child. I just know it. Here's what she said. She said, it actually puts a wedge between us and people who say these things, because I can't listen to someone who says what they think I want to hear when it has no basis. There's no scripture that says Mary will have more children. So we need to stop playing God and saying to people, God's just going to give you a child. I know it. You don't know that. You don't know that. And in your attempt to try to encourage, you're driving a wedge between you and that person, because they just see you as someone who's wanting to quench the grief with some trite expression. I think what we mistakenly think is that when the person is grieving, what they need is a fresh perspective. And yes, over time, we do want their perspective to change, but in that moment, what they need is not a new perspective. What they need is time and freedom to grieve. I can't stress this enough. I know it's redundant, but I'll say it again. The Bible tells us that grieving is a natural part of life. There's a time to do it. So don't try to fix someone's grief. So instead of saying things like this, you can say, well, actually, in the book, it suggests that if you ever come to a grieving person, and the first thing you want to say is a sentence that begins with, well, at least you have your health. Well, at least you have your job. Well, at least you have other children. If that's your mindset, the suggestion is just say nothing. It may sound a little harsh, but I tend to agree. Number 3. Don't you think it's time to move on? What do you mean when you say that? You say, I hate seeing you sad. Let's find an end to this grief. Sure, you don't want your friend to be sad. You don't want your fellow church member, your loved one, to be sad. And perhaps you've gotten over grief about a similar thing. Maybe it took you 2 months to get over your grandparents' loss, and this person lost a grandparent, and it's been 6 months. And so you can't relate to that, and you say it's time to move on, time to get over your grief. And you mean well, you want them to be happy. But what they hear or what they think when you say that is, my sadness is a problem. You're communicating the exact opposite of what we're trying to establish in this class, that sadness is not in and of itself an issue. Yes, people can be sad about the wrong things, but losing a loved one is sad. Therefore, sadness is not a problem. It's that simple. So what can you say instead? You can say, I will be here with you for as long as you are grieving, and to help you move through this grief and discover joy again. By the way, when I give these suggestions, I'm not saying you have to say this rehearsed phrase, but this is how you frame it. You allow them the freedom to take as long as they want to grieve and say, I will be with you as long as you grieve. You're committing to bearing that burden. You know, we talked about this illustration of bearing a burden. Somebody, I think I was in the church building and there's a piano, so I probably pointed the piano and I say, you know, if so-and-so is picking up that piano and trying to move it across the room, and you say, there's no way you can do that. Let me help you. And then 2 or 3 or 4 people pick up the piano, and now the piano becomes a lot lighter and people together can carry it across the room. When you say something like this, it's like you're forgetting your commitment. You're just saying halfway through the move, this piano is too heavy for me. I'm going to let it go, and you should let it go too. That's what we're communicating, so be careful of that. Do we want them to discover joy? Of course. But notice that the way this is framed says, help you move through this grief, not move over, get past, but move through the grief, because God gives joy in the midst of sorrow, not once the sorrow is completely gone. Number 4, this must be God's will. Now, this is the one where I have to be super careful how I say this, because I don't want to get all the Calvinists upset. And I speak that as myself, a card-carrying, tulip-sniffing, 5-point Calvinist. Our church confesses, the London Baptist 1689 Confession, right? We believe God is completely sovereign. There are no maverick molecules. I think that on the philosophical and even emotional level, it's worse to believe that God is somehow not involved, not powerful enough, sort of step back and just let the world, chaotically do its thing. I think that for us to believe that is to buy into the current epistemology of Darwinism and natural selection that basically says that the universe is meaningless. We are the result of random chance over billions of years, and we're nothing more than bags of molecules banging into one another. And so that car accident, that cancer, that tragedy that happened is really just life taking its course. There's no purpose. There's no meaning. I reject all that. You ought to reject all of that. The Bible's clearly against that position. And we confess God's absolute sovereignty. He is sovereign in salvation. He is sovereign in setting up kings, disposing kings. And the Bible talks about God being sovereign over calamity and sovereign over famines. And Joseph recognizes that even the very evil things that his brothers meant to do to him, God meant for good. So God doesn't just look down from heaven and see bad things happen and say, I think I'll fix that one, but I can't fix this one. I mean, God is the one who allows or doesn't allow these things to happen. Even functional atheists, as they drive down the road and almost get hit by a truck, and at the last minute, someone swerves and they get saved, and you have that moment of, whew, that was close. Oftentimes people say, thank God. And we give God glory for preventing tragedies from happening. Doesn't that logically mean that when tragedies do happen, that God allowed that to happen? Or are you confessing that God's not powerful enough to happen? So this is my caveat. My caveat's to say, of course, we affirm that everything happens under God's sovereign will. And God's sovereign will is good. And nothing takes God by surprise. And God never changes. And so this statement, this must be God's will, is technically true. But going back to what we said about tact, sensitivity, timing, doesn't mean that this is something that needs to be administered to the grieving, especially as they're feeling the heaviness of that grief. I am not advocating in any way, shape, or form of watering down the truth of God's sovereignty, of it's okay to be a little heretical. Not saying that at all. You'll see what I mean when we get to what you could say instead. But to understand the sensitive nature of what you're dealing with. Don't come in armed with a systematic theology and the idea of, I'm going to fix the grief by just telling them all the truths of God's word. You have to know how to handle God's word. So this must be God's will is likely your attempt to help the person find the peace of God by understanding his sovereignty. And again, I agree with this 100%. If you understand that God is both good and sovereign, and you have a biblical understanding of this, it will induce peace in you. You will have peace. And you want your friend, your grieving friend and loved one to get there, right? You want them to experience the peace of God that passes all understanding, that comes as a result of understanding God is completely sovereign and completely good. But remember that Paul says to administer words that build up as fits the occasion, to administer one grace to someone. So it's one thing for maybe a few weeks or months after the tragedy to be invited into a friend's dialogue who wants to have a meaningful, extended dialogue with you with Bibles open. That is a wonderful opportunity to explore God's sovereignty. But in a brief interaction, a coworker just returns after a leave of absence, or you're at the funeral, or whatever, they just found out, to simply say that's God's will might communicate something that would only make the matter worse, right? It communicates something. God wanted my loved one to die. What you're telling me in this moment, as I am grieving the loss of my loved one, you are telling me, oh, and by the way, God wanted this to happen. God caused this to happen, right? You're basically saying to me that God gave my mother cancer, or God made this suicide happen. And that communicates to the person that even though this situation is horrible, because it's God's will, it's actually good, and now you're horrible for feeling the way you feel. Now, I know that escalated quickly. I'm not suggesting that you're walking into the situation wanting the grieving person to feel shame and guilt for not accepting God's will. But that's what you're communicating at that time, and that's why it needs to be reconsidered how you talk about God's sovereignty to their pain. So instead, what you can say is something like this. First, you could acknowledge that you don't understand everything there is to know about God's will. I don't care how well versed in Hebrew and Greek you are and how much you've memorized the Bible and the catechism. The fact of the matter is, God doesn't call those of us who believe in God's sovereignty to be robots, the so-called frozen chosen, that are able to sit back stoically and look at all the tragedies in the world and say, well, that's God's will, so it doesn't bother me. That would go completely against everything we've talked about in session 1, right? There's a time to mourn, a time to weep, a time to grieve. We grieve because it's part of human nature. Jesus himself wept at Lazarus' funeral, at Lazarus' grave, knowing full well what he would do to Lazarus just 4 days after, right? Pretty amazing. So he knew that he would raise Lazarus, and yet he still wept. How much more for us who know God is sovereign, who know there's a hope in heaven, who know there's a Christ who came out of the grave, can still weep, right? And so the fact of the matter is, we've used this illustration before. It's like if you're standing on a patch that's part of a cosmic quilt, right? All you see is that patch. You don't know what the quilt looks like, but one day you'll zoom out in a sense, and you'll see the entire tapestry, the entire quilt, and it'll be beautiful. You could trust that things will make sense in the end, but right now you could also be honest that things don't make sense right now. I don't know why God allows children to have cancer. Yeah, I mean, we have these pat answers. Let's be honest. I mean, we live in a sin-cursed world, and that is an appropriate answer. The world is corrupt because of sin, and so children get cancer. But it doesn't make it any better. It doesn't make it any more palatable to know that they're suffering at that level, right? And so when you enter into your friend's sorrow, you yourself can start thinking about your own sorrow and thinking about how I can't put all the pieces of the puzzle together. I know God is sovereign. I take him at his word. I know he's good, but I don't understand why God would allow this in your life. I say that as a pastor. Look, my job is to open the Bible and explain the Bible and minister the Bible to people. But it doesn't mean that I'm going to have this pat answer as to why God allows for this. I think the Apostle Paul had a great understanding of God's sovereignty, right? But yet he says in Romans that his heart is in increase, or how does he say it? Like unquenchable sorrow, consistent pain, because his kinsman Israel rejected their Messiah. He even says, I wish I could be a curse for them. So don't deny the reality of the sorrow just because you have this full-orbed view of God's sovereignty. Whether you're a Calvinist or an Arminian, you should be able to weep with those who weep. And so you could say, I don't understand why God would allow this in your life. You could say, I struggle with this too. You could say, I can't wait for the day when God will put an end to death once and for all. But I pray that he gives us faith to trust his promises and timing. You see, if you frame it this way, you're not preaching heresy. You're not watering down the doctrine of sovereignty. You're acknowledging that God is the one who allowed this. You're acknowledging that his purpose and timing has something to do with this, but you're also acknowledging that you don't have all the answers and you struggle with this too, and that you still have to rely upon God to give you the faith to trust in his promises. I think when you do that, you enter into the sorrow a lot better. When you come armed with the systematic theology and you say, this is God's will, it's like you've assumed seminary professor level and you're sort of talking down to the person for not believing in God's sovereignty like you do. So please be careful with how you use this statement. As one person said, theology is grounding in ultimate hope, not a formula book to explain away each individual event. Another thing people might say is, I would have liked to come to the funeral, but, and this is quick, it's just to say, listen, if you couldn't make it, you may have the most legitimate excuse in the world, but there's no reason for you to have to justify something to your grieving friend. You can simply apologize for not being there. Now, the book also suggests, if you're close with a friend, that you could even offer to watch a video of it. It depends on the situation, but the point of this is to say that this is not about you, and you may be feeling a certain type of way, guilty perhaps for not going to the funeral, but don't pounce on your friend when you see him or her, just so you can sort of get yourself in the clear, right? It's not about you. Just apologize for not being there. Number 6 is saying the pain never goes away. Now, this is interesting because the first 5 or 4 of the 5 were sort of all about the opposite, right? Trying to get the person to get over their pain and even to the point where you trivialize or delegitimize their pain. But this one is the exact opposite, right? This one is making the pain perhaps seem worse than it really is. This is a phrase or a form of a phrase that often comes from people who have experienced loss themselves. And again, in each one of these instances, we need to not impugn bad motives to people, but to believe they have the best intentions. And the intention of saying the pain never goes away means I felt this loss too. Your loss is real and it stings, right? And those are good things. This actually is very consistent with what we've been teaching for these 3 weeks now, that you're entering in to their sorrow. You're acknowledging the stinging nature of this. But what they hear when you say that is this. They hear you say, the pain I feel right now is my new normal, so get used to it. The person who says the pain never goes away obviously is himself still grieving. But it could be that they're still grieving years after the tragedy, which means that the type of grief they're experiencing now is different than when it first happened. So they're at a certain point in their grief process, talking to someone who's just started the grief process, saying the pain that you feel now, the heaviness you feel now, to this degree, is your new normal. And that's actually not true, right? I think that we need to shy away from saying that the pain will stay the same my whole life, even if we want to acknowledge that life will always be different. And that might seem like a subtle difference, but you could be 20 years removed from the loss and still feel it, but you may not feel it to the same degree you did 20 years ago. And so you need to be careful, even when you try to relate to people, because you've experienced loss, to not say things that make them feel like that is their new normal. So instead, you can say something like, I know that life will never quite be the same, but I pray God will give you joy in the midst of your sorrow. Number 7 is, just call me if you need something. Yeah, this is a principle that we could apply to every ministry situation, not just grieving. You find out someone in church had a baby, or is moving, or needs, is having an interview coming up, or these life decisions, and you may good intentions, you want to help, and maybe you don't know how to help, so you're putting the ball in their court to reach out to you. Now, the person who's moving might take you up on the offer and say, yeah, I need you to help come and move with me. But it's much less likely that the grieving person will take you up on the offer. Matter of fact, if it's part of a funeral line, they probably heard person after person after person saying, I'm here for you, call me if you need me. Again, believing the best about people, you probably mean that you will drop everything for that person. But after hearing it time and again, the fact of the matter is it becomes empty. Even if your promise is not empty, it will feel like an empty promise. And so 9 times out of 10, they're not going to reach out to you and say, oh, remember when you said at my funeral, my grandfather's funeral, that you would be there for me if I need. Well, I really need you to go get groceries. Like, it's just not going to happen, right? So what we need to do instead of what you should say instead is what you should do instead. What you should do instead is to show up. We need to show up. We need to bring them stuff. Don't ask, just do, right? Show them your love with your action. Here's some suggestions, right? Show up to their house, take care of whatever they need. Call them when you're at the store. Not, I'm going to go to the store on Thursday, but you're at the store and you're saying, I'm here. What can I get for you? What's on your grocery list for this week? And if they're too timid, then, buy them some random things, things that everybody can use, and bring it to their house. Go to their house. If they have a lawn, you can mow their lawn. If they need painting, paint. If you need to fix something, fix something. Bring them food that you bought. Bring them food that you made. Pick them up. Take them to church. A lot of people, when they're depressed or grieving, don't have the motivation to get out of the house sometimes. But if you offer to pick them up, maybe they'll come with you to church, come with you to the park, go for a walk, take them to a restaurant. Offer to do their taxes for them, or whatever sort of paperwork. Maybe there's even paperwork that is related to the death and the funeral costs and things like that. You can help them with that. If it's a couple who's gone through a tragedy, one of them lost a parent or they lost a child, offer to watch their kids while they go out on a date, spend time together, so on and so forth. And you can think of a lot of other suggestions in this category, but just call me if you need something is not going to cut it. We need to show up and minister to them. Number 8, I guess God just needed him in heaven more than we need him here. I've seen a lot of variants of this phrase. What do people mean when they say this? I have no idea. Who knows? This is a theological mess. The idea that the God of the universe, who is self-sustaining and self-sufficient, who needs nothing, would somehow look down on earth and say, I need that person up here more than they need them down there, is just absolutely ridiculous, has no basis of truth, and should not be used. You can say, it's hard to think about life without him. I miss him. Number 9, I know someone else who. When you are armed with stories of people maybe you can't relate. You never had the loss of a loved one, or the loss of maybe a job or moving away, that would inspire grief in somebody. But you thought about your coworker or your cousin who went through the same thing. So in order to try to relate to the person, you start saying, well, I know someone who was in your situation. But what they hear when you say that is they hear, I guess my loss isn't unique. Why am I so sad? Again, you don't mean to say that, but you're putting their loss in the same category as someone else's loss. And maybe from a purely, categorical way of looking at things, it's true. But like snowflakes, right? No two people and no two situations of grief are alike. Someone who lost their father, and this person lost their father, but the relationships they've had with one another are different. The manner in which it happened is different. The manner in which they grieve is different. And so don't try to compare. We talked about this, I think, in session 2. And so instead, just say something like, I cannot compare your loss to anything. Nothing can compare to this. Finally, number 10, and I was a little bit shocked, I guess, when I read this to think, wow, what does the author mean by this? We all ask this question all the time, especially now in our day and age, because the expression "how are you" or "how you doing" has become a synonym for hello, right? How you doing? How are you? So as I read this, I recognize, okay, that there's definitely some legitimacy to why this could be an issue. When you say, how are you? In your mind, you are communicating that you care, right? So again, I'm not, the words, how are you, are not sinful to say. You're telling the person you care. You're reminding the person that you haven't forgotten about his or her grief. And you probably in that moment really want to know how you're holding up, how they're holding up, right? You want them to talk about their loss most of the time. I mean, look, let's be honest. We've used the terms "how are you," the term "how are you," in trite ways. There's no doubt. We're in a hurry. We say "how are you," and we're technically hoping that they don't talk. But by and large, I'm assuming that when you say "how are you" to the grieving person, you really want to know how they are, and so the motives are good. But here's what they hear. Oftentimes they hear something like or what they think I'm being put on the spot and I must answer correctly. Listen to this. If someone might say, if I say I'm fine, they'll know that I'm not and I'm being disingenuous. If I say I'm terrible, that might seem whiny. If I say I'm angry, well, that's unacceptable. Can't say that. If I say I can't stop crying, then that might be pathetic. Now, the grieving person is the one who's self-conscious. Perhaps they could say any one of those options and you will be there for them and talk them through it and pray with them, but they're self-conscious because they feel as though they've been put on the spot. David Guthrie says, in the midst of my own pain and confusion, I suddenly also felt responsible to others to give an account for my progress. As the words of my reply came measured through my lips, I wondered if my report would be acceptable. So I know you don't mean to do this, but when you simply say, how are you? It's as though you're putting the grieving person on the spot and they have to give you a report of how they're processing grief only for you to judge that report. And that's why it's very difficult for them to put those things into words. So instead, what's suggested is you can say something like, how good to see you, and follow up with a token of love. In our COVID-19 season, it may not be a hug, but if you can, hug. Hopefully, we'll be able to do that soon as well. But if you're really close to the person and you have a trust relationship with the person, you can say, what is your grief like these days? Now, that might seem like, well, how are you? It's the same thing, right? But what is your grief like is acknowledging that they're grieving. So they don't have to worry if their answers seem like they're still grieving. They're not going to be judged. You're showing them that it's safe to tell me how you feel. You can say, I think of you often. You can say, I pray for you often, if it's genuine. Remember, we often have a problem with this. Bob says on Sunday to pray for me, or he tells the church a prayer request, and you think, I'm going to pray for Bob. And then all throughout the week, you go through your life and you forget to pray for Bob. You come to church on Sunday, there's Bob, and you say, and then you quietly say, Lord, bless Bob. And then you go up to Bob and say, hey, Bob, praying for you. We shouldn't ever want to be dishonest to those who are grieving. So if you genuinely are praying for that person on a regular basis, really entering into the throne room of God and petitioning on their behalf, then let them know. Instead of saying, how are you? Say, I prayed for you. I am thinking about you. I'm concerned for you. You could also simply say, please come over today. Please come to my house. And you're not saying, come to my house to talk about your grief. You're just saying, come to my house. And offer them lunch, offer them dinner. And almost inevitably, when you sit down for a while and you talk and you're drinking your coffee, the person will open up and talk to you about how they're processing grief. So in one sense, all those suggestions are forms of how are you, but they express a better desire to enter into the sorrow instead of merely getting a report about it. What else can we say? I'll wrap it up with this. based on a survey of people who have lost loved ones, there are two things in particular that were noted that grieving people really wanted people to say. So I gave you suggestions of what to say instead of those things, but there are two principles to keep in mind that grieving people mention. And it may surprise you, but they are, number one, meaningful and memorable stories about the deceased, and number two, to keep saying the name of the person who died. This is tough for those of us, like maybe you can relate to me, who just feel like, tears and silence and heaviness is just very awkward, right? Even as a pastor, I still struggle with that. I want to keep things lighthearted. I want to keep things, non-emotional. But to minister to the grieving is a commitment to enter into their sorrow, right? And so you're entering that heaviness. You're bearing that burden with them. So if you try to avoid it, yeah, you'll probably not mention the person that died, because by mentioning the person that died, you're going to bring up memories that could lead to tears. And so our natural tendency is to just not talk about it, right? But yet, interview after interview, correspondence after correspondence, we're told that the person actually would like you to talk about the person who died more. And that makes sense now, right? When you think about it, it makes sense, because the reason they're sad is because they've lost someone they loved. And that person, when they think about that person, often brings a smile to their face, even though they're also crying because the person's gone. And there could be other reasons. There could be unfinished conversations. There could be guilt. The last conversation they had with the person could not have gone the way they wished. I mean, there could be a number of reasons why. But when you share memorable stories, meaningful stories of the person, it brings them back to enjoy the experience of that person, and even to have you, in a sense, legitimize the importance of that person in their life. So we're not saying, don't just say, trite things like, he was nice, she was funny, but to say, one time I remember your grandma did this. Oh, I remember Charlie. Yeah, he really was the life of the party, whatever it is. And but the more specific, the more memorable, the more meaningful, the better. If you're someone who's more creative, it's suggested you can write down stories. Write down the stories you remember, send an email, write a handwritten note, write a letter, put it in a card, and give it to the person who's grieving, and they'll cherish it forever. If you're even more creative, you can make a scrapbook, a compilation picture, a video, whatever. At first glance, it might seem like, oh, I don't know if I want to mess around with, the deceased here, but really, this is what people would love to have, is a collection of stories and memories that they can look back on. If you're not sure, maybe it's a coworker that you don't know well, but you attend the funeral, or a church member that you don't really talk to. Well, you might say, well, I don't really know their grandma. I don't really know their daughter. I don't really know their husband. Then ask questions. Ask questions. Say, I remember Ron, but we only talked a few times. Tell me more about him. I remember Barry, but what was Barry like growing up? What was your grandma's favorite memory, your favorite hobby? Things like that. So just ask those questions, and you're entering into that person's sorrow, but also the joy that they have in sharing stories about their loved one. And it helps also to keep saying the name of the person who died. It's uncomfortable for us, but death doesn't mean a person's name ceases to be spoken. And so you can be specific. I thought of Charlie the other day. I passed by Cheryl's favorite store. I ate a pie that reminded me of your mother, Sharon, so on and so forth. The Bible has a lot to say about names, and when people die in the Bible, their names aren't forgotten. We carry on their memory, we carry on their legacy, and the person who's grieving would like that legacy to continue for their loved one as well. So share meaningful stories and keep saying the name of the person that died. In summary, it is better to say less than say something trivial or empty. Remember that Ephesians 4:29 tells us to reject corrupt speech, evil speech, wicked speech, but also to embrace speech that builds up. Many of us have gained victory in one area, but we're not quite there. We're still in the idle words, trivial words category. Please recognize those and rephrase them that they may minister grace. Remember tact and timing. Yes, there are truths of God's word that are universal, but the way that you administer them matters. Do not seek to undermine their feelings, make them feel as though mourning and grieving and sadness is wrong, sinful. They are not. Avoid trite expressions that can be misinterpreted. And seek to minister grace by word and action. Show up, bring food, write cards. Remember that our words can tear down or build up, but most of us are stuck in the middle. Meaningless, empty words. While we should strive to rid ourselves of idle chatter generally, such talk is definitely not fitting for those who are grieving. So as we choose to minister to the grieving, by legitimizing their loss, entering in, being present, bearing their burdens, let us avoid trite and empty phrases that do no good. Sure, I'm sure we're going to forget the list of do's and don'ts from last week and this week, but I hope that it's helpful just to take some of these principles with you, always remembering that it is not a problem to be sad, and thus you don't enter into this mindset of being the one who has to fix things. Speak words of life, speak truth in love, speak about the deceased, speak to their pain. The hope is that our words would affirm what they feel so that they may find God's grace in the midst of their darkness. God bless you.